while later episodes make her one of the more controversial parts of the series, I've always found Rose Quartz to be one of the most interesting characters in Steven Universe, especially in the earlier seasons where every mention of her name felt like getting another breadcrumb of information as the viewer assembled what her personality truly was, as everybody in Steven's life seems to have a different memory of her, making her true self one of the show's biggest early mysteries. But the most interesting character relative to their relationship with Rose has gotta be Greg, as despite ultimately being the one to get closest to her, he also knew the least about her, which makes the 3-ish episodes featuring the pair in the past really interesting. And none of the 3 highlight the beautiful oddity of their relationship more than Season 2, Episode 9, We Need to Talk. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this video, as we dive into the episode and discuss how it uses some truly tremendous sequences, including perhaps the best song of the series, to show how despite being different species and barely knowing anything about each other, Greg and Rose still worked.
Here's all the Orange Magic Orchestra ones.
Great! Put them in the Transcendental Space Rock pile.
The frame story opens up with Connie and Steven listening to old records with Greg outside of his van, which gives the audience a quick reminder of Connie's parents being the exact opposite of Greg, as she's never even heard of any of his records. Greg takes his opportunity to play her a song, which immediately leads to her dancing with Steven, creating this really nice moment to kick off the episode. The chillness of the scene doesn't last very long though, as Steven and Connie accidentally fuse, leaving Greg shocked and Stevani horrified. The first really interesting moment of the episode, and the moment that first indicates the direction this episode is heading, is the first question that Greg asks once the pair unfuse. Instead of asking what happened, he instead asks how did the pair fuse, which given Greg's comic lack of knowledge regarding gem stuff is pretty odd. While Connie is busy freaking out about her parents finding out about her magic shenanigans, Steven pieces together that Greg must know something about fusion, which prompts him to begin his story, which takes us back to the 20th century before the audience can even begin to ask why Greg didn't mention that he had a tape of Rose to Steven sometime before Lion 3. The flashback starts off with What Can I Do For You, a duet between Greg and Rose, and probably my favorite song from the entire series. Starting just from a sound standpoint, the song simply slaps, being this 80s style rock jam that ends with a guitar solo that's just exceptionally great given its placement in a cartoon soundtrack. But what's really special about this song is the visuals and the lyrics that go along with it, which both go hand in hand in establishing the theme of the episode and the nature of Rose's and Greg's relationship. A large portion of this episode will reveal itself to be about Greg feeling like Rose doesn't respect him as a partner, and this song includes many lyrics that hint towards this reality, like Rose referring to him as fun and entertaining, and singing that she likes to quote play along with humans. Adding to this feeling is the show's use of framing, which it uses quite frequently in this episode, placing Rose on a literal stage to emphasize the already pretty large height difference between the pair, making it even more obvious that Rose is looking down upon Greg. The episode also does various things during this section to hide or shade Rose's eyes, symbolizing Greg's feeling that Rose doesn't really see him as an equal, but instead just a plaything. The chorus and title of the song come from Greg's perspective, as he asks what he can do for Rose that the humans that she's loved before didn't, as his smile from the beginning begins to fade. This section also has a double meaning that applies to Pearl, as she shows Greg something that she can do that no humans can, fusing into rainbow quartz perfectly in sync with the music to create a terrific scene that, besides just having the excitement of introducing a new fusion, also has the full announcement of the love triangle between Greg, Rose, and Pearl that becomes the focus of multiple episodes beyond this point. The bitterness from Pearl continues after Rose bails, as she reiterates what Greg already fears about his status as a novelty, saying that he can't fuse with Rose and thus can never reach true connection. Greg refutes both of these claims in a mic drop of his own, stating that he's gonna try and fuse with Rose, which brings us to the second half of the episode. As Greg begins watching film to prepare for the game of love, he gets advice twice from Garnet. The first time getting the literal truth that he can't fuse because his body isn't made of light, something that does conflict a little bit with Connie's part of Stevani, but whatever. And the second time getting more metaphorical advice advice to dance the Greg way in order to fuse the Greg way, which becomes a large focus of the dance scene later in the episode. Speaking of which, Greg takes his advice as confirmation in his ability to fuse, as Rose teleports in and Greg begins his romantic gesture, which is a dance across a lighted floor as the pair elegantly make it to a conveniently placed stage for Greg to finally be on the same level as Rose, as he dips her as a result of their newly similar heights. Despite Rose being obviously enamored by this enormous gesture by Greg and completely starstruck, he can't enjoy the moment, as his disappointment in the realization that the pair are still separate beings without a real connection just kind of bums him out. Greg can't help but verbalize this thought, which leads to Rose standing back up, looking down on Greg once again, and laughing at him. In between laughter, Rose continues to make statements that clearly fail to realize Greg's lack of respect and security. After this point, Greg can't help but verbalize his fears, which are met by more laughter, which Greg responds to with his first goof during this conversation, being that he asks Rose to talk to him like a real person. These words shock Rose out of her laughter, as she realizes that Greg is being serious and doesn't understand his plea for genuineness, instead thinking that he's somehow unaware of the fact that she's not a human. It's this moment where Greg begins to finally fully internalize the fact that he is dating an actual alien and begins to question his future with Rose, deciding that the only possible remedy to their differences is to finally just talk, as the pair embrace, reaching the figurative fusion that Garnet was referring to. There is a lot that you can pull from their conversation while embraced, as Greg tries to find common ground between the two by finally asking the questions that he's never asked before, like how is Rose's home planet and how does she meet the rest of the crystal gems, but every question is met by a quick and immediate response from Rose containing little to no information. There is a quiet moment in the middle that I want to focus on for a second though, where Greg and Rose discuss whether or not they've loved humans in the past, where they both confirm that they have. When Greg asks if Rose had ever been in love with a human though, she's confused by the difference, which Greg describes as torture. Rose, lacking any ability to interpret hyperbole, is horrified by the statement, which causes confusion and discomfort for the first time in their relationship, as she experiences the type of torture that Greg was alluding to, signifying that for the first time, she doesn't just love Greg, but is in love with Greg. As the pair dance to the realization that their confusion means they finally have something in common, Pearl begins to finally accept that Greg and Rose may be more than a fling, as they joyfully dance across the stage. The episode isn't done yet though, as it has time for one more sting back in the frame story. As Greg wraps up his tale, he uses it to pivot to his connection to Connie as the only other full human being to engage so heavily with gems, leading to the final moment of the episode that we're going to be talking about towards the end of the video.
Human beings?
Human beings. Human beings.
It shouldn't come as a shock to you that fusion is portrayed in Steven Universe as a pretty big part of gem relationships, but as the end of this episode illustrates, contrary to Pearl's claims after the song, fusion is more of a reflection of one's relationship rather than the relationship itself, as while some can and do grow within their fusion, it's perfectly possible for a gem to form a good relationship without one, as seen with Peridot and Lapis later in the series. But back to Greg and Rose, this episode does something really interesting regarding how their metaphorical fusion comes to be, as instead of going the obvious route of Rose telling Greg about her past with the war and such, the episode instead goes a different way with the idea of being open, as the pair instead discuss what they want in their relationship and how they feel about their relationship, with no discussion of their past. And this is what ultimately results in them being able to finally come together. Once the pair finally actually talk to each other instead of at each other, they finally see one another as something besides weird tall space alien and goofy human being, and actually as individuals worth investing in. But besides just giving us some insight on a relationship that ended 14 years before the series begins, this episode also shines a light on something that will play out throughout the rest of the show, being Steven's struggle with his identity. The first season is largely about Steven feeling out of place in the Crystal Gems, and throughout the season he feels more and more accepted and like he's actually a gem. But this feeling begins to fade after the events of Jailbreak, and in this moment, as shown through the heart-wrenching moment at the end of the episode, Steven begins to realize that he could not fully relate to his human friends and family either, and because of his status as the only human-gem hybrid, he will always feel a bit alone. But while this episode does end on a bummer note, the overall message of the episode is certainly positive, as the story of Rose and Greg coming together applies to Steven as much as it does in its intended audience and Connie, as he'll ultimately find that, throughout the series, the way for him to overcome the lack of commonality that plagues his relationships is exactly the same as his parents. He just needs to talk. Anyway, that's gonna be about it for me. If you have a show or an episode of Steven Universe or any other cartoon you want to see me talk about, leave it in the comments. And if you want a more direct way to tell me that my opinions are bad, my Twitter is in the description, where you can also just happen to see what I'm working on next. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you on Saturday to fulfill a promise I made on this channel back in December. Thanks for watching.